In 1903, a young couple stood before the camera, hoping to capture the happiest day of their lives. The bride wore a gentle, almost hesitant smile, while the groom radiated pride and quiet elegance. On the surface, everything seemed perfectly ordinary, a simple wedding portrait. Yet, decades later, when historians examined the photograph closely, they noticed something peculiar, something that would turn this ordinary image into one of history's most perplexing mysteries. A tiny pin, fastened to the groom's lapel, an emblem that should not have existed at that time, quietly hinting at a movement that would only emerge years later. What you are about to hear may challenge everything you thought you knew about early 20th century America. The morning of October 17, 1903 dawned crisp and clear over the small town of Millbrook, Connecticut. Autumn leaves painted the streets in deep amber and crimson, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. Inside a modest Victorian home on Maple Street, 24-year-old Elena Hartford adjusted her ivory wedding gown for what must have been the 100th time. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened the delicate pearl buttons running down her spine, each one a tiny challenge for her nervous fingers. Behind her, her mother Margaret offered gentle words of reassurance. While arranging the veil, a piece passed down through 3 generations of Hartford brides. The lace had yellowed with age, yet it remained striking, as if carrying the hopes and dreams of all the women who had worn it before. Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears, which she hid carefully, not wanting to worry her daughter on such an important day. Across town, in a small boarding house near the railway station, 28-year-old Thomas Whitmore stood before a cracked mirror, carefully knotting his silk tie. Thomas had arrived in Millbrook only 18 months earlier, taking a position as an accountant at the local textile mill. A quiet, meticulous man by nature, his dark hair was neatly parted, and his grey eyes seemed to notice everything with an intensity rare for the time. Sitting on the edge of a narrow bed, Thomas's only friend in town, Robert Chen, watched silently. Robert had immigrated from San Francisco 3 years prior, one of the few Chinese residents in this predominantly white New England town. Despite the prejudices of the era, Thomas had befriended him immediately, a gesture of progressiveness that was unusual for the period. "Are you certain about this?" Thomas Robber asked, his English still carrying the soft melodic tones of his Cantonese upbringing. "Marriage is a serious commitment." Thomas smiled, though his gaze was distant, as if it were resting on thoughts far beyond the present moment. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Robert. Eleanor is exactly what I've been searching for." He reached into a small wooden box on the dresser and pulled out a silver pin, examining it in the dim morning light. The emblem, about the size of a quarter, was intricately designed with geometric patterns that, when viewed as a whole, formed a larger mysterious symbol. Robert noticed it, but said nothing, assuming it was simply a family heirloom or a fraternal badge, common for men of the era. Thomas fastened the pin carefully to his left lapel, adjusting it until it sat perfectly straight. He ran his fingers over its surface once more, as if drawing strength or reassurance from it, before turning to his friend with renewed confidence. The wedding ceremony was set for 2:00 p.m. at the First Congregational Church, a white clapboard building with a modest steeple that dominated Millbrook's small-town square. By 1:30, guests began arriving in their Sunday-best women in high-collared dresses and elaborate hats, men in dark suits and bowler hats. Slowly, the church filled with 57 people, representing the couple's combined social circle. Elena's extended family colleagues from the textile mill, church members, and a few acquaintances of Thomas from his previous life in Boston. Reverend Samuel Morrison, a stern man in his 60s with wire-rimmed spectacles and a reputation for long sermons, greeted each guest personally at the door. He had known Elena since childhood and had initially harbored reservations about this outsider who had arrived in town and captured the heart of one of Millbrook's most eligible young women. Yet Thomas had proven himself respectable, attending church services regularly and displaying the moral character the Reverend valued. Elena arrived precisely at 2:00 p.m., her father William Hartford walking beside her, pride visible in his eyes. William owned the general store on Main Street and was well respected in the community, a position that made him fiercely protective of his only daughter's reputation and future happiness. As they processed down the aisle, Elena's heart pounded so loudly she could almost hear it herself. Thomas stood at the altar, his posture perfect, his expression serene, yet deeply moved as he watched his bride approach. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the modest stained glass windows, casting patterns of colored light across the wooden pews and the faces of the assembled guests. In that moment, everything felt timeless, suspended outside the ordinary flow of hours and days. The ceremony proceeded according to tradition. Reverend Morrison gave a shorter than usual sermon, focusing on the sacred bonds of marriage and the responsibilities of husband and wife. Thomas and Elena exchanged their vows in clear, steady voices, slipping simple gold bands onto each other's fingers. When Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, a collective sigh of satisfaction rippled through the congregation. Afterward, the wedding party moved to the Hartford home for a modest reception. Margaret had spent days preparing the food-roasted chicken, fresh bred vegetables from the garden, and a small but elegant cake adorned with delicate sugar flowers. And yet, pause for a moment and let your mind linger on that tiny silver pin on Thomas's lapel, a symbol that in 1903 should not have existed. Was it merely a family heirloom? Or could it have been a quiet harbinger of something far larger, something hidden beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary day? The guests mingled in the parlor and slowly spilled out onto the front porch, their voices a gentle murmur against the crisp October air. They spoke of crops and weather, of the recent astonishing news that the Wright brothers had flown a powered aircraft in North Carolina. It was Elena's cousin Frederick who suggested taking a formal wedding photograph. Frederick had recently acquired one of the new Kodak cameras and was eager to demonstrate his skill. The suggestion was met with delight, though at the time formal photographs were still somewhat costly and uncommon for ordinary families in 1903. Thomas and Elena posed in the front parlor standing before the fireplace, whose mantel was adorned with family photographs and a small collection of porcelain figurines belonging to Elena's mother. Afternoon sunlight streamed through lace curtains, illuminating the couple with a soft, even glow, free from harsh shadows. Frederick adjusted his camera on its tripod, instructing them to remain perfectly still for the long exposure required. Elena stood slightly to Thomas's left, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Her expression was a delicate mixture of joy and the somber composure typical of photographs from that era. Thomas stood tall and proud, his left hand resting naturally at his side, allowing a clear view of his wedding attire, and the mysterious silver pin fastened to his lapel. The camera shutter clicked, capturing that single frozen moment in time. No one present that day could have imagined that this simple wedding photograph would over a century later become the subject of intense historical scrutiny and endless speculation. It would be analyzed, reanalyzed, examined with technology that did not exist in 1903, and debated by experts who struggled to explain what their eyes clearly revealed. As the reception stretched into the evening, Thomas and Elena received congratulations and warm wishes from their guests. Thomas remained particularly attentive to his new bride, rarely leaving her side, speaking to her in low, gentle tones that made her blush and smile. To all who looked on, they seemed precisely as they appeared, a young couple embarking on life together filled with hope and promise. Yet, there were subtle, almost imperceptible details that would later seem significant. The way Thomas occasionally touched the pin on his lapel, as if ensuring it remained secure. The brief, intense conversation he shared with Robert Chen in the corner of the parlor, voices so low that no one else could hear. The moment when Elena's father drew Thomas aside, his expression serious, questioning Thomas about his family background and receiving answers delivered with practiced smoothness, yet curious vagueness. As twilight descended upon Millbrook and the guests began their journey home, Thomas and Elena stood together on the front porch, watching the last traces of sunset fade from the western sky. Elena leaned against her husband, exhausted, yet content, already imagining the life they would build together. Thomas wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his expression thoughtful as he gazed into the growing darkness, perhaps contemplating secrets that Elena could never have suspected. Mysteries destined to remain hidden for generations. The early years of Thomas and Elena's marriage unfolded with the quiet predictability of small-town life in early 20th century America. They rented a modest two-story house on Chestnut Street within walking distance of the textile mill where Thomas worked and Elena's childhood home. Built in the 1870s, the house bore the gentle wear of time-creaking floorboards, windows that rattled in strong winds, and a small back garden where Elena planted roses and vegetables each spring. Thomas proved to be a devoted husband by the standards of the era, though Elena sometimes sensed an emotional distance in him, as if part of his mind remained elsewhere. Each morning at precisely 7, he left for work carrying a leather satchel filled with ledgers and correspondence. Each evening at 6, he returned, washed his hands at the kitchen pump, and sat down to whatever meal Elena had prepared. After dinner, he would retreat to the small study they had set up in an upstairs room, claiming to work on mill accounts and personal correspondence. Elena rarely questioned his habits. Women of her generation were taught to respect their husband's privacy and dedicate themselves to running a proper household. She spent her days cleaning, cooking, sewing, visiting her mother and socializing with other married women of Millbrook. She attended church socials and charitable activities organized by the Ladies' Auxiliary. Her life followed the patterns expected of a respectable married woman in 1903, and she found contentment in this structured existence. Yet, there were peculiarities that Elena could not entirely ignore, though she tried. Letters arrived for Thomas with unusual frequency, delivered in plain envelopes with no return address. He read them behind a closed door in his study, never leaving them lying around the house. When she once asked about the letters, Thomas smiled and explained they were correspondence from colleagues in Boston regarding business and investment opportunities. A reasonable explanation, though somehow it never fully satisfied her curiosity. Thomas also made regular trips to Hartford, the state capital, claiming business with banking institutions there. These trips happened monthly, always on the second Thursday, leaving early in the morning by train and returning late that same evening. He returned tired, though sometimes his weariness seemed to hint at something more than simple fatigue. Once, when Elena Nena suggested she might accompany him to enjoy the city's shops, Thomas gently, yet firmly discouraged the idea of Elena Nena accompanying him, explaining that his business meetings allowed no time for leisure. Robert Chen remained Thomas's closest friend, and the two men spent considerable hours together, sometimes at the boarding house where Robert still lived, other times wandering along the wooded paths surrounding Millbrook. Elena Nena liked Robert and appreciated his kindness, yet she noticed that conversations between the two men would abruptly halt whenever she entered a room, only resuming once she had left. She told herself she was being foolish, that perhaps men simply had topics of discussion that did not concern women. Yet, the lingering feeling of exclusion never fully left her. In April of 1905, Elena Nena announced that she was expecting their first child. Thomas received the news with visible joy, embracing her in a way she had rarely seen him show so openly. For several weeks he seemed more present, more engaged in the rhythms of their daily life together. He spoke with enthusiasm about the future, about the child they would raise, the family they would build. During this time, Eleanor felt closer to him than she had at any point since their wedding. But as her pregnancy progressed, Thomas's mysterious patterns quietly resumed. The letters continued to arrive. The monthly trips to Hartford remained uninterrupted, and new behaviors emerged, subtle, yet impossible for Elena Nena to ignore. At night, she would awaken to find Thomas's side of the bed empty, discovering him standing at the bedroom window, gazing out at the darkened street, as though waiting for someone or something. When she asked if he could not sleep, he would return to bed, holding her gently, yet offering no explanation. Their daughter, Margaret Rose, named after Elena Nena's mother, was born on a snowy December morning in 1905. The birth was difficult, attended by the town doctor, and Elena Nena's mother lasting nearly 16 hours. Thomas paced anxiously in the parlor below. And when he finally held his daughter in his arms, Elena Nena saw tears glistening in his eyes. Whatever secrets her husband carried, whatever mysteries surrounded him in that moment, she knew he loved their child wholly and genuinely. The years that followed brought a second daughter, Helen, in 1908, and a son, William, in 1910. The Whitmore household grew lively with children's voices. Thomas appeared to find genuine happiness in fatherhood. He played with the children in ways uncommon for men of that era, kneeling on the floor to build block towers, reading bedtime stories, teaching them to identify birds and plants during weekend walks. Yet, the enigmatic aspects of Thomas's life persisted and even intensified. In 1909, he traveled to New York City for what he described as an important business meeting, staying away for 3 full days. He returned looking worn and troubled, though he assured Elena Nena that all was well. That same year, she discovered a newspaper clipping hidden in one of Thomas's books, an article about labor organizers and social reformers, carefully cut and preserved. When she asked about it, Thomas simply replied that he was interested in current events, his tone closing any further discussion. Their wedding photograph, taken by cousin Frederick in 1903, sat in a silver frame on the parlor mantel, a quiet testament to the beginning of their life together. Elena often paused while dusting to look at it, remembering that perfect October day when everything seemed clear and simple. She studied her own young face, full of innocent hope, then shifted her gaze to Thomas, searching in his expression for a clue to the mysteries she sensed but could not name. The children grew, seasons changed, and Millbrook itself slowly transformed from a quiet agricultural town into a more industrialized community. The textile mill expanded, bringing new workers and families. An automobile appeared on Main Street in 1912, causing great excitement among residents. Beyond Millbrook, the world was shifting rapidly. News of labor strikes, women's suffrage, and growing tensions in Europe reached even this small Connecticut town. Thomas followed these developments with an intensity that Elena found both impressive and unsettling. He subscribed to multiple newspapers, reading them thoroughly each evening, engaging in animated discussions with Robert Chen and a small circle of men about politics and social reform. Elena sometimes overheard fragments of these conversations talk of workers' rights, economic inequality, and systemic change, topics radical for their conservative community. And then, in the summer of 1913, a stranger arrived in Millbrook. A man asking questions about Thomas Whitmore, lingering in town with a purpose Elena could not discern. The man who introduced himself as a journalist researching successful New England businessmen spoke with several townspeople before approaching Elena directly. Polite yet persistent, he asked about Thomas's background, his activities, and his acquaintances. Elena answered as best she could, realizing, with a quiet pang, how little concrete information she truly possessed about her husband's life before Millbrook. That evening, when she mentioned the journalist's visit to Thomas, his reaction was immediate and intense. His face paled and he questioned her urgently. What exactly had she said? What had the man asked? Where had he gone after speaking with her? Then, as if catching himself, he softened, apologizing for his sharp tone, and explaining that he was concerned about competitors at the mill trying to steal trade secrets. The explanation seemed plausible, yet a cold knot of anxiety coiled in Elena's stomach. That night, Thomas was once again standing at the window, gazing at the street. The next morning he left unusually early, and Elena noticed him speaking intently with Robert Chen on the corner. Whatever they discussed, the journalist departed that same day, never to be seen in Millbrook again. Elena wanted to demand answers, to insist that Thomas explain the shadows and secrets that clearly surrounded their lives. But she was afraid of what she might learn, afraid of disturbing the stability her children needed, afraid of challenging the rigid social norms dictating a wife's proper role. So she remained silent, attending to her household duties, raising her children, and trying to ignore the growing certainty that the man she had married in 1903 was not entirely who he appeared to be. The wedding photograph remained on the mantel, that frozen moment of happiness and hope. Elena could not have known that decades later historians would examine that same image with magnifying glasses and sophisticated technology, not focusing on her face or the couple's expressions, but on the small silver pin attached to Thomas Whitmore's lapel. A pin that would become the center of one of history's most intriguing mysteries, raising questions that would never be fully answered. The Whitmore family photograph remained untouched in a dusty cardboard box for nearly 60 years. After Elena's death in 1954, Thomas followed just 3 months later. Some said from heartbreak, though others noted his health had been declining for years. Their belongings were distributed among their 3 surviving children. Margaret Rose, the eldest daughter, received several boxes of family photographs and documents, which she stored in her Hartford attic without examining them closely. Her own life and family demanded her attention. The past seemed less urgent than the rapidly changing present of mid-20th century America. It would be Margaret Rose's granddaughter, Jennifer Whitmore, who would inadvertently awaken the mystery decades later, captivating historians and amateur researchers alike. One afternoon in 2018, as Jennifer helped her grandmother downsize from the large family home, she stumbled upon the forgotten boxes tucked away in the attic. Thomas gently yet firmly discouraged Elena from accompanying him, explaining that his business meetings allowed no time for leisure. Robert Chen remained Thomas's closest friend, and the 2 men spent many hours together, sometimes at the boarding house where Robert still lived, other times wandering the wooded paths that surrounded Millbrook. Elena liked Robert and appreciated his quiet kindness. Yet she noticed that whenever she entered a room, the conversations between the 2 men often stopped, abruptly resuming only after she had left. She told herself she was being foolish, that men simply had topics of discussion that didn't concern women. And yet, the subtle feeling of exclusion lingered like a shadow at the edge of her awareness. In April of 1905, Elena announced that she was expecting their first child. Thomas received the news with visible joy, embracing her in a way she had rarely seen him display so openly. For several weeks, he seemed more present, more engaged with the rhythms of their daily life together. He spoke enthusiastically about the future, about the child they would raise, and the family they would build. During this time, Elena felt closer to him than she had at any point since their wedding. But as her pregnancy progressed, Thomas's mysterious patterns quietly resumed. Letters continued to arrive. The monthly trips to Hartford continued without interruption, and new behaviors emerged, subtle, yet increasingly impossible for Elena to dismiss. She would wake in the middle of the night to find Thomas's side of the bed empty, discovering him standing at the bedroom window, staring out into the darkened street as if watching for someone or something. When she asked if he couldn't sleep, he would return to bed without answering, directly holding her, gently saying nothing. Their daughter Margaret Rose, named after Elena's mother, was born on a snowy December morning in 1905. The birth was long and difficult, attended by the town doctor and Elena's mother, lasting nearly 16 hours. Thomas paced anxiously in the parlor below. And when he finally held his daughter for the first time, Elena saw tears glistening in his eyes. Whatever secrets her husband carried, whatever mysteries surrounded him, she knew in that moment that he loved their child completely and genuinely. The years that followed brought a second daughter, Helen, in 1908 and a son, William, in 1910. The Whitmore household became alive with the laughter and cries of children. Thomas seemed to find real joy in fatherhood, playing with his children in ways unusual for men of that era, kneeling on the floor to build block towers, reading bedtime stories, and teaching them to identify birds and plants during weekend walks. Yet, the enigmatic aspects of Thomas's life persisted and even intensified. In 1909, he traveled to New York City for what he described as an important business meeting, staying away for 3 full days. He returned looking haggard and troubled, though he assured Elena that all was well. That same year, she discovered a newspaper clipping hidden in one of Thomas's books, an article about labor organizers and social reformers carefully cut out and preserved. When she asked about it, Thomas explained that he was merely interested in current events, his tone closing any further discussion. The family's wedding photograph, taken by cousin Frederick in 1903, remained in a silver frame on the parlor mantel, a quiet testament to the beginning of their life together. Elena often paused while dusting to look at it, remembering that perfect October day when everything had seemed so clear and simple. She would study her own young face in the photograph, seeing the innocent hope in her eyes, then shift her gaze to Thomas, searching for a clue in his expression to the mysteries she sensed but could not articulate. The children grew. Seasons passed. Millbrook itself slowly evolved from a quiet agricultural community into a town gradually embracing industry. The textile mill expanded, bringing new workers and families to the area. In 1912, an automobile appeared on Main Street, sparking excitement and curiosity among the townspeople. And yet, amidst these changes, Thomas remained a figure of quiet mystery. What thoughts lingered behind his grey eyes? What secrets did the small silver pin on his lapel conceal, the one no one had yet questioned too closely? The world beyond Millbrook was shifting rapidly. News of labor strikes, the women's suffrage movement, and rising tensions in Europe filtered even into this small Connecticut town. Thomas seemed to follow these developments with an intensity that Elena found both impressive and slightly unsettling. He subscribed to multiple newspapers, reading them thoroughly each evening. He engaged in animated discussions with Robert Chen and a small circle of other men talking